The safety briefing had been running for 40 minutes when my phone lit up on the table in front of me. I should have ignored it. I was the inspector. 7 miners were watching me walk through emergency evacuation protocols for the new shaft at the Smithers site, and a text from a 16-year-old kid who lived next door to my house wasn't exactly grounds to stop mid-sentence. But I looked at it anyway. "Mr. Mercer, something's wrong at your place. I can hear Wyatt screaming from inside. He sounds really scared. I knocked, but nobody answered. Should I call somebody?" The room kept talking. I didn't hear any of it. I pulled up the app on my phone, the one I'd installed on every camera in the house 18 months ago, right after my wife passed. I told myself at the time that it was because I needed to feel connected to my son when I was away for work. My therapist said it was grief in a practical disguise. She wasn't wrong. But whatever the reason, every room in that house had a camera, and they all fed directly to my phone, cloud-backed, always running. I opened the hallway feed. My son was 8 years old. He was small for his age, with his mother's dark hair and the kind of laugh that made strangers in grocery stores slow down and smile. He loved hockey and Lego, and a specific brand of dinosaur-shaped pasta that his mother used to make on Friday nights. A ritual I'd kept up even after she was gone, because some things you hold on to, not because they're easy, but because they're all you have left. He was not laughing now. Through the infrared feed, I could see him pressed into the back corner of the hall closet, the narrow one near the front door, the one with no window, the one where we'd kept winter coats and old board games for years. The door was shut. I could hear him through the audio, that specific sound a child makes when they've been crying so long. They've gone past sobbing into something rawer. A sound no parent should ever have to hear from 3 hours away by plane. Standing outside the closet door, my sister-in-law was on a video call, with her phone propped against the wall. 2 of her friends' faces filled the screen. She was laughing. "He's been in there almost 15 minutes, she said. "I told him dinner's not ready yet, and he needs to wait quietly. Apparently that's child abuse now." The man she'd been seeing for the past year, someone who'd never held a job longer than 8 months in the time she'd known him, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "He's gotta learn. You can't coddle them forever." One of the friends on the video call said something I couldn't make out. My sister-in-law laughed again. "He's fine. His dad's up north for 4 more days. Trust me, by tomorrow he won't even remember." I want to tell you I remained calm, that my years in the RCMP kicked in and I processed everything clinically and made rational decisions in clean sequence. That's not what happened. What happened was that I stood up from the table, told the 7 miners we needed to reschedule, walked out to the parking lot, sat in my truck, and pressed both hands flat against the dashboard, trying to remember how to breathe. Because here's what my sister-in-law didn't know, or knew and didn't care about, which is worse. My wife died on a Wednesday evening in November 18 months before all of this. My son was 6. He'd been home with his grandmother when the call came that his mother had taken a turn, and we'd driven to the hospital together in the dark, the 3 of us, in a kind of panic that turned out to be the last hours we'd ever have with her. When we got back to the house at 2 in the morning, my son had wandered away from his grandmother while she made phone calls, and I'd found him 20 minutes later in the back of the hall closet, curled up in the dark, crying himself out. He'd been hiding. He was 6 years old and his mother wasn't coming home, and he'd gone to the one small dark place that felt enclosed enough to hold all of it. He'd been terrified of that closet ever since. Not of closets in general, that specific one, because that was where he'd been, alone, the night his world ended. My sister-in-law had been at the house the morning after the funeral. She'd been at every family gathering in the months that followed. She had watched my son press himself against the opposite wall every single time someone walked past that closet door. She knew exactly what she was doing. I made 2 calls before I started the engine. The first was to Drew, who I'd worked alongside for 9 years in the RCMP's Serious Crimes Unit out of Surrey, before I transitioned to mine safety consulting. He answered on the second ring, heard 3 sentences of what I was telling him, and said, "I'm already in my car. Give me the address again." The second call was to my brother Roy, who lived 20 minutes from my house in Burnaby. He didn't ask questions, just, "I'll be there in 15. Then I pulled up the Air Canada app and booked the next available flight from Smithers Regional to YVR. Departure in 54 minutes, an hour and 20 in the air, ground transport after that. I watched the camera feed on my phone while I drove to the airport. I watched my son cry alone in a closet that smelled like old hockey equipment and loss, while the woman his mother had loved most in the world stood 6 feet away and entertained her friends with it. I watched the feed for the entire flight. When I landed, Drew had already sent a message. "We're here. Roy too. Police on scene. Wyatt is safe. He's next door with the neighbors, the kid who texted you. His mom got him. Come straight here." I drove from the airport to my house in Surrey in a time I won't put in writing. I don't recommend it. I don't regret it either. The scene when I turned onto my street looked like something out of a file I would have worked on in a previous life. 2 RCMP cruisers out front, lights running, an ambulance in the driveway, back doors open. Neighbors standing on their lawns in the early evening light, some with phones out. My sister-in-law was sitting on the front step in zip ties. Drew's contribution, I learned later, in the 45 minutes before the officers arrived. She was screaming at every uniformed person within reach about her rights, and the fact that this was a misunderstanding, and that I was a controlling, absent father who'd been looking for any reason to cut her out of my son's life. Her boyfriend was face down on the front lawn. He'd made the mistake of getting physical when Drew knocked on the door. Drew was 61 years old, built like someone who had never stopped taking the job seriously. And the boyfriend now had a dislocated shoulder and considerably more perspective than he'd woken up with that morning. Roy met me at the end of the driveway. He's 7 years younger than me and has always been the calmer one in a crisis, which was useful because I was not calm. "He's okay," Roy said first. "Physically. The paramedics checked him. Some bruising on his left arm. He's been asking for you every couple of minutes." "Where is he?" Roy pointed to the house next door. "I want to tell you about my neighbor Francis, who had lived next to us for 4 years, whose 16-year-old son Asher had sent that first text. She was 64, ran a family daycare out of her home, and had the particular talent of appearing with exactly what was needed before you knew you needed it. When she'd heard my son screaming through the shared fence and Asher had called 911, she'd come over herself and sat on her kitchen floor with Wyatt in her lap for the better part of an hour, reading him her grandson's dinosaur books and telling him his dad was coming. She'd done all of that without ever having had a real conversation with me. When I came through her front door, my son was on the couch under a fleece blanket, holding a mug of hot chocolate he hadn't touched. He was pale. His eyes were swollen. There was a bruise along his left forearm, the shadow of fingers, purple and deliberate. And seeing it in person, after seeing it only through a camera feed, was the moment I came closest to losing everything I'd been holding together since the parking lot in Smithers. He looked up, he said, "Dad," in a voice that barely existed. I crossed the room and sat beside him, and pulled him in carefully, mindful of his arm, and held him while he cried into my shoulder. He was shaking. I don't know how long we sat like that. Francis quietly moved to the kitchen. After a while, my son pulled back and looked at me. "She said you weren't coming back," he said. "She said you were going to call and tell her you found a new family, and I was going to live with her and Lance forever." I kept my voice steady. It cost more than I can explain. "That is not true," I said. "Not one word of it." He looked at his hands. "She said I had to stop asking for you. She said you put her in charge because you didn't want to deal with me anymore." He paused. "She said Mum always knew I was too much trouble. She said that's why Mum." He stopped. Couldn't finish it. I don't have the words for what I felt at that moment, and I don't think it would help anyone to read them if I did. What I will tell you is that I held my son and told him, clearly and without hesitation, that his mother had loved him more than anything in the world, that his mother had been an extraordinary woman, that every single thing my sister-in-law had said was a lie constructed by someone who wanted something, and had decided to use an 8-year-old boy to get it. What I didn't say, because he was 8 years old and had already endured enough for one night, was that I was beginning to understand that this hadn't started this week. Drew was waiting in the driveway when I came back out, my son asleep at Francis's with Roy sitting watch. He handed me his phone. "There's something you need to see," he said. "I went through 3 weeks of footage while you were in the air. Your cloud backup goes 90 days. I pulled what matters." On the screen were clips I had never seen. Clips from evenings when I'd called from site, and my sister-in-law had handed my son the phone for 10 minutes, and then taken it back and told me he was tired. He needed to go to bed. Stop checking in so much. In one clip, she sat across from my son at the kitchen table, her voice low and even, telling him that his father booked work trips specifically to get away from him. That the mine site was an excuse. That she'd heard me on the phone telling a friend that my son was the one thing holding me back from starting over. I had never said that. I have never thought it. In another clip, her boyfriend grabbed my son's arm, that same bruise, and dragged him toward the stairs because he'd knocked over a glass of water. Not yelling, worse than yelling, the flat, practiced voice of someone who had done this before and anticipated no consequences. Drew had time-stamped and annotated every clip. He'd also, and this told me exactly who Drew still was after 3 decades of law enforcement, already uploaded a complete copy to the RCMP's evidence server through a contact in E-Division Digital Forensics. Chain of custody documented. Admissible in court. There's audio too, Drew said. 4 days ago. She was on the phone in the kitchen. I think she forgot about the camera above the stove. He played it. My sister-in-law's voice, unhurried, talking to someone I didn't recognize. The guardianship application is ready to file. My lawyer says if I can show the court that Gavin is functionally absent, which, honestly, he practically is, they'll take it seriously. Especially once we get a psychological assessment showing the kid has attachment issues from inconsistent parenting. A pause. Once I have guardianship, the trust is mine to manage. Between the RCMP and the life insurance trust, there's $460,000 sitting there. $460,000. My sister spent her entire life being careful and responsible, and that money is just being administered by a man who's away 11 days out of every month. Another pause. I'm not stealing it. I'm taking what should have come to the family. Gavin was never good enough for her anyway. I stood in my driveway in the Surrey evening and listened to my dead wife's younger sister explain how she planned to take my son in order to access the money my wife had spent her life carefully building for him. The RCMP sergeant coordinating the scene found me standing there 2 minutes later. She introduced herself as Sergeant Poirier and told me my sister-in-law was being formally arrested on charges of unlawful confinement of a minor, criminal negligence causing bodily harm, and child endangerment. Her boyfriend was being charged with assault on a minor. The Crown would review the footage and determine what additional charges were warranted. I gave Sergeant Poirier Drew's contact in digital forensics. She looked at me for a long moment. "You used to do this job," she said. It wasn't a question. 9 years in serious crimes, I said. She nodded. "The footage is thorough. Your friend did good work." He always did. My son woke up at 3 in the morning at Roy's house in Burnaby, where we'd gone because I couldn't bring him back to our house that night. Not yet. He woke up crying, and I was already awake in the chair beside his borrowed bed. I held his hand until he fell back asleep. I did that for 11 nights in a row. His therapist, a woman at BC Children's Hospital, who specialized in childhood trauma and grief, told me that the specific combination of elements had been deliberate, whether my sister-in-law had articulated it to herself or not. The closet tied to his mother's death, the systematic lies about my absence, the stated goal of making my son believe that both of the people he loved most had left him. Children who are made to feel that completely alone, she said carefully, become very easy to control. The Crown prosecutor reviewed the evidence over the following weeks and filed additional charges. Intimidation of a minor, making false statements to a child, and, based on the kitchen recording, conspiracy to commit fraud in relation to a trust instrument. My family lawyer filed a civil injunction the same morning, freezing any attempt by my sister-in-law to pursue guardianship proceedings. It was granted in 48 hours. Her employer contacted me 3 days after the story ran in the Surrey Now Leader, and then the Vancouver Sun. She had been working at a licensed childcare center in Newton for 2 years. After the publication of the charges, and the fact that she had been narrating my son's distress to friends on video, treating his terror as entertainment. The childcare center terminated her immediately and referred the matter to the provincial licensing body, which launched a review of her entire tenure there. Her boyfriend's prior conviction for assault causing bodily harm followed by probation, was reviewed the moment the new charge was filed. He was taken back into custody. My sister-in-law's bail was contested. Given the recorded evidence of financial motive and the organized nature of what she'd been planning, the Crown argued flight risk. The judge agreed. She was remanded until trial. I want to be honest about something. In the months that followed, I spent a great deal of time being angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. I had trusted her because she was the last living connection to my wife. When my wife's mother had passed 2 years before her daughter, my sister-in-law had been the only one of that family left. She had come to my wife's funeral in a black dress and stood at the graveside and helped my son write a card to put in the casket. I had looked at her grief and seen the woman I had lost. I had let that cloud everything that came after. Sergeant Poirier put it plainly in one of the follow-up meetings we had during the investigation. People who intend harm often position themselves closest during a crisis. Grief is one of the most effective entry points there is. It doesn't mean you failed. It means you were human and hurting, and someone exploited that deliberately. I believed her, mostly. The rest I'm still working on. The trial took 8 months to reach sentencing. I won't walk through every session. What I will tell you is that the footage was played for the jury in full, and that the audio from the kitchen recording played in a courtroom filled with press and child advocacy representatives and every news outlet in the Lower Mainland. My sister-in-law's defense argued that she'd been overwhelmed, that she'd taken on too much, that caring for a grieving child had broken her down, that her boyfriend had been a bad influence, that she herself had unresolved grief over losing her sister. The Crown's response was methodical and exact. The evidence showed not a caregiver who had cracked under pressure, but someone who had over a period of months systematically told a traumatized child that his father did not love him, who had weaponized that child's specific terror, a terror that traced directly to the worst night of his young life, as a disciplinary tool, who had filmed it for friends, who had legal documents ready to file for guardianship the following week. The judge's sentencing remarks were the most precise I have sat through in a courtroom, and I sat in many during my RCMP years. My sister-in-law received 6 years in a federal institution. Her boyfriend received 3. The judge noted that given the deliberateness of the psychological harm, the exploitation of a child's grief, and the calculated financial motive, the court intended the sentence to communicate clearly that what had been done here was not a lapse in judgment. It was a campaign. My son was 9 by the time the sentencing was handed down. He didn't come to court for the verdict. He was at school, a new school, in Langley, where we'd moved 6 months earlier. The new house had a skylight in his bedroom. It had been his one specific request during the search. "I want a room where the sun comes in even when the blinds are closed," he told the realtor, with the gravity of a child who has learned that light is not something to take for granted. We also got a dog, a 3-year-old golden retriever named after his mother's favorite hockey player, which my son has specifically asked me not to make public. The dog sleeps at the foot of his bed. The nightmares come less often now. Some weeks they don't come at all. His therapist called me 6 months after we moved in to tell me something that had come up in their last session. She said she thought I'd want to hear it. My son had told her that the thing he'd been most afraid of, after everything, wasn't the closet or the dark or even the bruise on his arm. It was that he'd believed her, his aunt. He'd believed the things she'd said about me, even when a part of him had known they couldn't be true. And he'd been afraid, he said, that believing her meant he'd done something wrong, that it made him weak or disloyal to me or to his mother's memory. His therapist had told him that it meant nothing of the kind. That when someone you trust looks you in the eye and tells you a lie, believing it doesn't make you foolish or guilty. It makes you a child who was trusting someone who should have been trustworthy. She told me he'd nodded slowly and said, "Okay, I believe you." And then he'd asked if they had time for a card game before the session ended. I sat in the parking lot of her office and didn't drive for about 20 minutes. There are things I want to say to anyone listening. Trust your instincts about who has access to your children, especially, when that person is family. Grief makes us want to hold on to anything that feels like the person we've lost. I understand that from the inside. But a person being connected to someone you loved does not make them safe. It only makes betrayal harder to see coming. Document. Not because you're paranoid, but because documentation is what transforms a devastating event into an accountable one. My cameras were there because I missed my son when I traveled and wanted to feel less far away. They also saved his life. The two things are not contradictory. And if something feels wrong, if a child in your life seems quieter than usual, if they flinch at things they didn't flinch at before, if their eyes have gone somewhere they weren't before, say something. In Canada, you can reach the Kids Help phone anytime at 1-800-668-6868. In British Columbia, the Child Protection Reporting Line is 310-1234, no area code required, available around the clock. Contact your local Children's Aid Society. Talk to someone. The people who harm children build their entire structure around the assumption that no one will look closely enough, or speak up loudly enough, or move fast enough. Asher, the 16-year-old who heard my son crying through a fence and had the presence of mind to text a father 3 provinces away, broke that assumption in 4 sentences typed on a phone. I've told him that. He does what teenagers do when you say something sincere. He shrugs it off and says anyone would have done the same thing. He's wrong about that. I hope he never has cause to understand why. Last month, I drove my son to his first hockey game of the new season. A Saturday morning in October, that particular Metro Vancouver cold that isn't quite frost, but makes your breath show in front of you, the kind of morning that smells like a beginning even when you're not looking for one. He scored in the 3rd period. Nothing elegant, just a scramble in front of the net, and then somehow the puck was past the goalie, and the red light came on. And before he'd even finished raising his arms, he was already turning around to find me in the stands. I was already standing. He grinned, his mother's grin, exactly hers, and pointed at me from across the ice. I pointed back. We drove home with the dog waiting at the door, and I made dinosaur pasta for dinner, and we sat at the kitchen table under the window where the late afternoon light came in long and gold across the floor. And for the first time in longer than I can honestly calculate, my son fell asleep before I did.